So I think, first of all, in relation to the current events that are facing us as a country, we regard these obviously as absolutely severe. It is a very, very grave situation that is facing us. As organized business, I'm not quite sure what more can happen to our economy and our currency that needs to happen that we would consider this to be a crisis. It is a fundamental crisis for the economy. It's obviously a political crisis, and we are taking it exceptionally seriously. We think that notwithstanding the remarks by the President that the changes were made to make the Cabinet more efficient and in pursuit of radical economic transformation, that the consequences have been both immediate and profound. It damages the reputation of the country as an investment destination, and it damages our joint prosperity. I think Mondley mentioned earlier in terms of we need to make noise. The reality is that the current events that are unfolding will affect every single South African. And we think that we're not being effective enough in getting that message out. It's not just about business. This is going to affect the poorest of the poor. There's going to be less money available for social services. It's going to affect our ability to create jobs. It's going to affect the economy. And it's going to affect our ability to transform. I think that many South Africans are feeling very, very powerless at the moment. And that includes us as a business community as well. So what we plan to do in terms of exerting pressure is to partner as much as we can and coordinate as much as we can efforts to push back what is currently happening. We are calling on the ruling party to meet with us and act in the best interests of the country. We have asked to meet with the new Minister of Finance. We know that there are many dedicated National Treasury officials that remain there, and we are going to exert pressure in terms of staying the course and keeping to the commitments that have been made. We are actively engaging with organized labor. I met yesterday with the leaders of COSATU, FEDUSA, NACTU, as well as Zwelinzima Vavi. And there is a general concern. I think you all saw the response, even by COSATU, that's in alliance with the governing party. And moves are afoot to try and convene a dialogue in NEDLAC in the next few days to address the issue urgently. We are coordinating and aligning the business efforts. I think you've seen from the Busa constituencies a lot of messages. There's a lot of noise. It's all heading in the same direction, but we are seeking to make sure that we optimize that and we don't duplicate our efforts. In terms of the national minimum wage and labor relations stability process, it has certainly been an interesting journey. I was personally part of that in leading the technical negotiations from the business team over the past 2 years. And I think that we've come an immensely long way in that regard. I think that we've been able to find each other as constituencies. We have made compromises along the way, and those compromises have not necessarily been easy from any side. The national minimum wage of 20 Rand an hour was an evidence-based minimum wage. And I think that that's quite an important issue to bear your mind on, because it was arrived at on the basis of evidence and social dialogue in NEDLAC. The ability of SMEs to afford that is something that is of particular concern. And I think that there's two things that have to be said in that regard. The evidence demonstrated that the experience of SMEs on the minimum wage is very, very mixed. A quarter of SMEs are more able to afford the minimum wage than big businesses because they're very wealthy and they can actually afford the minimum wage. 3/4 of SMEs are going to struggle to afford the minimum wage. And we achieved commitments around the exemption process that are particularly to be designed with SMEs in mind. So what are those commitments? The one is that there will be a smooth and efficient exemption procedure. There's a commitment to a 30-day turnaround. There's a commitment that the documentation that has to be submitted is not going to place an undue regulatory burden on SMEs. In that regard, Busa has already been engaging with the Department of Small Business Development, as well as the Department of Labor, to say, how do we use existing instruments and mechanisms and processes and forms rather than requiring the SME to go through an additional regulatory hurdle in that regard. The types of things that are being considered is using UIF returns, using tax returns, and obviously not requiring a formal business registration number or annual audited financial reports as a basis to demonstrate affordability, because not every small business has that. And we looked across the political, the economic, the social, and the environmental dimensions, and we said, where is it that the business environment most needs to be corrected in order to provide the conditions for inclusive growth and employment? In terms of the BUSA strategy and SME action plan, there are 4 components. So the one is around business support services and information. The other is around regulatory burden. The third around strengthening the voice of small business. And the fourth around building skills for entrepreneurship and SME businesses. The important thing that I need to say is that as BUSA, we are very, very conscious and have very consciously recognized that we are not a representative voice of business if we don't represent all types of business. BUSA cannot just be a voice for big business. We know that employment contribution from the SME sector is sitting at approximately 65%. We've heard the figures in terms of what is the GDP contribution, and I know all these statistics are obviously subject to updating and review. But small business contributes an absolutely critical component of the business collective, and it is something that we have to take very, very seriously. I mentioned in passing, I indicated 65% employment contribution from SMEs. That's against a global average of 95%. I think it tells you the extent of the problem, is that if we can activate our small businesses, we can activate the economy. And finally, the last area that we spoke to in our BUSA action plan was the issue around building skills and entrepreneurship skills and technical skills for access by the SME sector. And in that regard, I want to say to you that out of the survey that we did of small businesses, the number one barrier to doing business was not tax, it was not the regulatory environment, it was not the economic climate, it was not the political climate, although that might change now. The number one barrier that was identified when we did the study was access to skilled staff. And I think that certainly is an issue not only for the SME sector, it is an issue for business as a whole. There is a fundamental mismatch between the skills that are being supplied into the labor market as to those that are needed. And if business does not do something fundamental to partner with government or to drive its own programs to develop the skills that we need for the current and future economy, we are actually going to seal our own fates. We need to do something fundamental in that regard. We think that synergy and effort will be needed across the different priorities in order for the small business sector to be able to thrive and grow and access markets and to actually be part of inclusive and deracialized growth in South Africa. We will work hand in hand with business and labor and governments as well as civil society to achieve these national objectives. I think the role of BUSA in terms of policy influence and pressure through NEDLAC is absolutely fundamental. And from a BUSA perspective, I want to thank the AHI and Dr. Messina and Mr. Swanepoel. And thank you for convening this initiative. Thank you for making BUSA part of it. We are very happy to have been part of it. Thank you.